So something unusual is happening in Canada right now. In the most conservative province in the country, support for the Liberal government is rising. And the reason might not actually be Alberta politics at all. It might be the world. Wars, trade tensions, and instability are reshaping how voters think about leadership. Because when politics starts shifting in places that were once predictable, it usually means that something bigger is happening.
A new poll shows support for the Liberals climbing in a province that has been the backbone of conservative federal politics for decades.
And that tells you something, right? The movement inside these numbers suggests something in the country may be shifting. The poll comes from Abacus Data, and it shows conservatives at about 51% support in Alberta. That's still a very strong position, and it reflects the reality that Alberta has been the most reliable conservative region in federal politics for decades. But what caught people's attention is that this number is down 13 points compared to the last election. At the same time, Liberal support has climbed about 36%.
When you compare those numbers to the last election, the shift becomes clearer. Conservative once led the Liberals in Alberta by about 36 points. According to this poll, that lead is now closer to 15. So Alberta is still very much conservative territory, but losing more than 10 points in a province where support is normally locked in, well, that is not something that political parties ignore.
And the poll was conducted between February 20th and February 25th, and it surveyed about 1,000 Albertans. Statistically, it carries a margin of error of just over 3%. Now, that means the exact numbers could move slightly in either direction, but the overall trend is still worth paying attention to. And the most interesting part of the data is not the provincial average, it's where the change is happening inside Alberta.
Right. The most surprising part of the poll is where the change is happening. The movement is coming from Edmonton, where voters are now leaning Liberal over the Conservatives.
Wow. You know, according to the survey, support in Edmonton sits around 47% for the Liberals and 40% for the Conservatives. That means the capital city of Alberta is currently showing more support for the Liberal government than the Conservative opposition. Heck, even the pollster described the situation as a bit of a political bizarro world.
Now, Calgary tells a slightly different story, but even there, the numbers are closer than many people would expect. Conservatives lead Calgary with about 49% support, while the Liberals sit around 39%. Now, that still gives the Conservatives a clear advantage, but it also means that Calgary is not quite the uniform political bloc it once appeared to be.
And when you step back from the numbers for a second, there's actually a broader story here. For a long time, Canadian politics has treated Alberta as a fixed point on the map. Conservative parties would win overwhelming majorities of seats, and Liberal campaigns often focus their energy elsewhere. But politics rarely stays frozen forever.
Yeah, urban Alberta has been changing for years. Cities like Edmonton and Calgary are younger, more diverse, and increasingly tied to global industries beyond oil and gas. Universities, technology firms, and service sectors have grown alongside the traditional energy economy. When cities evolve economically, their political conversations tend to evolve as well.
Yeah, Edmonton in particular has always been a bit different politically from the rest of the province. It has a large public sector workforce, a major university, and significant population of younger voters. Now, that mix has historically made the city more politically competitive than rural regions where conservative support remains extremely strong.
So when a poll shows Edmonton leaning Liberal, it isn't entirely shocking if you know the city's political history. What is new is the scale of the gap that's narrowing across the province as a whole. And that leads us to one of the most unusual elements of the current political movement.
The Prime Minister of Canada right now is an Albertan. Mark Carney grew up in Edmonton and often describes himself as someone shaped by Alberta's economy and political culture. For decades, one of the most powerful arguments used in Alberta politics was that Ottawa simply didn't understand the province.
Well, that argument becomes harder to make when the person leading the federal government spent much of his life in the province. According to the poll, Carney's approval rating in Edmonton sits around 52%. In Calgary, it's closer to 45%, And outside the cities, okay, it dropped significantly, but the numbers still show a more complicated picture than the usual narrative.
Another development may also be influencing voters. Earlier this year, an Edmonton member of parliament named Matt Genereux crossed the floor in Ottawa. He left the Conservative caucus and joined the Liberal Party.
But it shows what's happening because 3 people have crossed the floor this year. That is huge.
And of course, people naturally ask, what motivates change like this? Well, sometimes it's ideological, sometimes it's strategic, and sometimes the explanation is internal party disagreements that the public never fully sees. But whatever the reason, events like that can shift the conversation locally because they signal that something inside the political coalition may be moving.
There's also another factor quietly shaping the political environment right now in Alberta. Over the past year, there has been a renewed discussion in some circles about the idea of Alberta separating from Canada. Did you hear about that? While that idea gets attention in certain political spaces, polling consistently shows that most Albertans actually prefer to remain part of the country.
Some surveys suggest that roughly 2/3 of Albertans would vote to stay in Canada if a referendum were held. Now, that creates an interesting political dynamic that Canadians have seen before. In Quebec, when separatist debates intensified, Federalist voters often rallied around the party they believed would defend national unity.
If voters become concerned about instability or fragmentation, some may gravitate towards the party that they see representing a stable federal framework. Historically, that role has often been filled by the Liberals.
And that brings us to the global context surrounding this poll. The survey was conducted before the most recent escalation in the Middle East involving the United States and Iran. Since then, international tensions have intensified and oil markets have reacted accordingly.
When you look more closely at what's happening in the country right now, the numbers start to make sense. The poll isn't just about Alberta politics, it reflects a broader movement in Canada where the political landscape is shifting because the world itself is becoming less stable.
Yeah, Canada is dealing with several pressure points at once, right? The United States under Donald Trump has become more unpredictable towards its allies, to put it mildly. There's also the growing conflict in the Middle East that could affect the global energy markets, and we're seeing it already is. And Canadians are watching the international system become more uncertain than it has been in years.
Yeah, Canada's relationship with the United States is under strain, to say the least. The administration of Donald Trump has pursued policies that have unsettled many traditional allies, though, including trade actions and diplomatic pressure that have complicated relations with countries outside of Canada that normally cooperate closely with the United States.
So in moments like that, voters often start thinking differently about leadership. Instead of focusing purely on ideology, people start asking who they trust to manage a crisis. And that question may be helping explain why support for Prime Minister Mark Carney is growing, even in places where Liberal leaders traditionally struggle.
And that question is where Mark Carney's professional background becomes politically relevant. Before entering politics, he served as governor of the Bank of Canada during the global financial crisis. Later, he led the Bank of England during the economic uncertainty surrounding Brexit.
So his career has been built around navigating economic turbulence. In stable times, that resume can feel distant from everyday politics. But in uncertain times, it can become an asset because voters associate it with competence during a crisis.
The poll also measured favorability ratings for the two main leaders. About 40% of Albertans say that they have positive views of Mark Carney, while only 37% say that they view him negatively. For Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, the numbers are very similar, which is surprising, with 41% positive and 38% negative.
Those numbers are essentially a tie. And again, remember, this is happening in Alberta. And so that alone suggests that the political environment is becoming more competitive than many observers ever expected. If urban centers like Edmonton and Calgary become competitive, well, then the national electoral map could start looking quite different. Federal elections in Canada are often decided by a relatively small number of seats. Even a handful of additional seats from Alberta could matter in the closest contest.
There are also signs of cooperation emerging between Alberta and the federal government on certain economic issues. Recently, Ottawa and the province reached an agreement allowing Alberta to take greater control over regulatory reviews for major projects. Discussions have also taken place around new pipeline initiatives, and Danielle Smith, she actually is really cooperating with Mark Carney's Liberals.
So when federal and provincial governments find areas of common ground, it can actually soften the political tensions that often dominate national debates. Voters, hey, they sometimes respond to that shift because the political atmosphere feels less confrontational. Political landscapes, they rarely change overnight, but they do evolve over time. Regions that once seemed, politically immovable can gradually become competitive as demographics shift, economies diversify, and new leaders emerge.
Alberta may still be the heart of the Conservative federal support, but the numbers in this poll suggest the story is becoming more complex than it once was. Urban voters appear more open to considering different political options than they were just a few years ago.
Now, whether this represents a temporary moment or the beginning of a longer trend, well, that remains to be seen. Polls capture just a snapshot in time. And political momentum, well, we all know that can shift quickly depending on events and leadership's decisions.
But moments like this are still worth paying attention to because they remind us that political maps are not permanent. They are reflections of how voters respond to the issues and leadership they see in front of them around the world.
If Alberta cities become competitive ground, well, then both major parties will have to adjust their strategies. Conservatives will need to work harder to maintain their dominance, and Liberals, hey, they may see opportunities in places where they previously invested little to almost no energy.
So in other words, Canadian politics may be entering a period where old assumptions no longer fully apply. And when that happens, elections become a lot more interesting.
Yep, because politics doesn't stand still for long, right? We all know that. And when a place that has been politically predictable for decades suddenly starts moving, well, it usually means that something bigger is happening.
All around the world. So we want to hear from you. Are you seeing changes in your country? If you are in Alberta, are you seeing this shift in the conversation around you, or are these just the polls?
Let us know in the comments because we do want to hear from you. And remember, if you want to support this channel, check out the pinned comment below. That's where we put our Substack, our merch, and the rest of the places that you can find us.
And if you enjoy calm analysis in a world that feels a little chaotic right now, make sure you're subscribed because we'll keep breaking it down every day.
Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Ciao for now.